Well, good afternoon, everyone. Well, welcome to Who Has the Hammer? It's a question that comes up many a time, but first of all, let's talk about this. We hear this a lot. It's hard to get work done around here. This is one of the biggest pain points that impacts business. What's the impact? Well, at the executive levels of an organization, they see this as not achieving our goals. At the front line, it's actually too much bureaucracy and red tape. We are just not achieving our goals from that standpoint as well. So today what we're going to talk about in authority and getting work done is, first of all, what is authority? How do I get authority? And what are the types of authority? But first of all, we want to talk about a little known concept of who actually has the hammer, right? That's the title of our presentation today. Well, it's all about our expectations. It's about the expectations that you have of me and I have of you. We're talking about authority and how the lack of clarity around authority interferes with getting work done. So from that standpoint, let's talk about what is authority. What is authority? Well, we define authority as legitimated power. Vertically, managers have legitimate power to require their direct reports to do work. But what happens when work is actually occurring laterally? In fact, we find that over 70% of the work inside organizations is done laterally. So we have the vertical and then the lateral. But if managers are the ones who hold their direct reports to account, and are, I should add, the only ones to do so, how do I get that work done laterally? It's all about managers providing clarity on the authority that you need to be given in order to get that work done. So as I said earlier, this is all about getting clarity on the authority that people need to have in order to get work done. Have you ever heard the term, Michael, just sort it out? We often hear this from CEOs. Have you ever heard that term?
Absolutely. It's just go figure it out yourself, that sort of thing.
Or we just hear also from CEOs, they should just know what sort of authority they require. After all, I pay them really well. Well, we term these as abrogation of managerial accountability. In other words, you can't just ask people to sort it out. So the point here is that authority is about clarifying who gets to do what. Now, what about authority in a matrix organization? Many of you are going to ask, well, I live in a matrix organization. If you happen to be in a multinational, for example, you may in fact be living this reality. So how many of you out there actually do work in a matrix organization?
And Julian, I've got a poll I'm going to send out to the audience right now asking about that. Let me just launch that out here. Why don't you keep going for a minute while we get some responses here.
So when you're talking about those aspects of matrix, you need to consider what is a matrix. We hear the term used a lot. We hear it a lot from our clients. But what do those dotted lines actually mean? And so you have to gain clarity on these aspects of the dotted lines.
Interesting you should mention that, Julian, because we've got an indication here that the majority of attendees are actually in matrixed organizations, so clearly this is very relevant.
Well, I think one of the things you should be asking yourself right now is, what do I really mean by matrix? Because can you really have two bosses? There can be, quite literally, only one boss. Otherwise, it's fundamentally unfair. For example, if you have two managers doing a performance evaluation, who are you going to respond to? Is it going to be manager A or manager B? If they're both doing your performance evaluation, which direction do I turn? Do you have two sides to your face? No. So you have to have that clarity of who is actually my boss. Now, some employees actually like this idea of having many bosses.
No, so playing off people, that's one thing.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that, the analogy that I use is that it's the mom and dad analogy. So Mom said this when I say it to Dad, and Dad said this when I say it to Mom. So I can actually kind of hide behind either one of them. So it's important to gain this clarity on what do those dotted lines actually mean. And as we go forward today, I think you're going to find that there are ways to gain clarity through this authority discussion.
All right.
So what we're trying to do then is getting us to clarifying what do those dotted lines actually mean. So this actually leads us to, well, what are the types of authority? We divide these into 7 categories, 7 types. These are all the categories that you need to provide clarity about who has the authority to get what, from whom, in which instance.
Okay, so more than just the hammer, it's when you're allowed to use it and on whom and what reasons.
Exactly. By categorizing authority into these 7 buckets, we've actually streamlined the authority discussion. It provides a framework which our clients find quite handy to use when they're trying to define work and defining how to get the work done.
Right.
It's no longer a nebulous, open-ended process. I'm going to go into these types of authority a little more detail as we go forward into the webinar. I just want to introduce this concept of these types of authority. So why does authority get us so worked up? Well, before we dig into this, we really need to understand why authority is important to us as human beings. Authority is seen as the power to influence others. In other words, I have a way to influence people. But actually, I would suggest that authority is all about our need for control. Control is key for us as human beings. Some of you out there right now are probably a little uncomfortable with this. You're pretending not to want to control others. Well, the reality is we as human beings, we need it. We need to control our external world. So it is about this influence and control. Anything that challenges our ability to control makes us uncomfortable. And so it becomes a natural reaction. It is the nature of our initial reaction to imminent change that we create a resistance to this. So anything that challenges our control, we actually try to rail against. So it's important to clarify what are the degrees of control. So let's talk about this nature of control, because as you're examining the realities of authority, you need to really look into control. So how much control do we actually have? Well, we refer to the 3 states of control. They're kind of like the states of water, for example. They are the aspect of where I have full control over something. In other words, I have complete and utter control over someone or that thing, or partial control over someone or something, and then ultimately no control over someone or something.
A full spectrum of control.
Absolutely, and it's important for us to understand this. If you have read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey refers to the latter 2, partial control and no control, as spheres of influence and spheres of interest. It's important to define what are those measures and how do I expand my influence. When you have full control, that's where you have all of your work. So you need to ask yourself about the things that you do day to day in the workplace. Do you have full control, partial control, or no control? In fact, we find with number 3 that most people are upset over number 3 because they don't have control and they would love to somehow gain control. Those are the things that are outside their sphere of influence, but why, gosh, I've got to be involved in them somehow.
And it's not like these are crazy dictatorial types. These are just people who just by their nature, as human beings, are seeking some sort of control.
Exactly. So ask yourself this about the work in your day-to-day work. When you make a decision, presumably that is full control. But do you actually have the authority to make that decision? Do you have the authority to have full control over that? Do you have to get service from someone? Is that full control or is that partial control? I would argue that it's actually partial control. And when you call a meeting, is that full control or is that partial control? In other words, do you have control over someone to come to your meeting? You need to ask yourself this. So now that we've discussed what is authority, it's time for us to look at how do I get that authority. Authority emanates from where? Well, where do you get this authority? Quite often, authority is an issue of a personal desire, right? That aspect of my control. So we term this a will to power. It is my personal sense. So is it about seizing power, or is it about having accountability bestowed upon me, someone giving me power?
Okay.
In between those two, seizing power and accountability, is that sense of responsibility. So in other words, in sense of responsibility, I'm trying to seize power, but I might not have accountability.
Sounds like the worst of both worlds when you think about it.
Absolutely, but what we find is that in most organizations, they are built around a sense of responsibility and don't necessarily have a discussion of accountability. Now, you need to bear in mind what is accountability and what is responsibility. Now, Michael, if you had an Oxford English Dictionary in front of you right now, you would look up accountability and it would say, see responsibility.
Right.
And if you look up responsibility, you'd say, see accountability. So play with this definition for a moment. Accountability is a component of a relationship. For example, a manager and a direct report relationship. In other words, a manager gives a direct report and accountability and holds them to account, whereas responsibility is my personal belief. Because it is that personal belief, it becomes the will to power again. So here is your conundrum for you. How do I get this authority if it's not bestowed on me? How do I know whether I have that authority? It is about clarity of accountability. So while I've been talking about this authority, the precursor to accountability is, or pardon me, authority is accountability. I have to have the clarity of accountability before authority. The point here is that accountability drives what sort of authority. And I can't be held accountable if I don't have the commensurate authority.
Yeah, that sounds like it'd be unfair.
Absolutely. So if it does not emanate and it is not sanctioned, you won't have much luck getting authority over others. And quite often what happens is that if it hasn't been sanctioned, hasn't been clarified, then people seize authority or try to seize authority. They try to grab it. And when they do that, in other words, that dark red face there,
right.
When they do that, they begin to annoy others. All it is them trying to eke out their existence in the workplace. So it becomes quite annoying for others when people seize power without them being sanctioned. So who defines accountability and authority? That's the real question here. Now, I've already given you a hint to that, but quite frankly, it's your boss. Often we believe that we know what we're supposed to do, yet our manager has never fully defined it for us. And in a lot of cases, you have to ask yourself, has my boss really defined what I have to do as an end state? Or am I just left to my own devices? If I'm left to my own devices, then how do I get authority? Well, I have to seize it if there isn't that clarity.
Right, of course.
So right now, if you're a manager out there, ask yourself this. Have I defined the work of my direct reports? clients or my employees? Have I actually sat down? And I guess the other question to that is, am I an inadvertent perpetrator of unclear authority?
So in effect, if your boss hasn't defined your work/accountabilities, it would then follow that you probably then don't know what the authority is, what the authorities are. Or even if you have been, if your accountabilities have been identified, your authorities may not have been.
Exactly. So the point here is I can't delegate authority if I don't have it. So right now, if you're thinking about it as a manager, have I clarified and defined the work for my direct reports and what sort of authority? I can't give them authority if I don't have the authority myself. So your first job is to find out what sort of authority you actually have. What has been bestowed on me in order to then bestow accordingly on my direct reports.
In effect, driving some sort of accountability clarity with your manager at the same time.
Exactly. Now, I'm sure some of you are sitting out there right now going, this feels kind of flunky and clunky and chunky and ultimately hierarchical. Why can't we all just get along? Now, why do we have to go to these great lengths? Just let me get on with my work. Well, great people can get along. It is very true. But what we found is that when stress inevitably occurs, it is useful to start with clarity on accountability and authority. Great people do really get along well. But what happens in the stress of everyday life, when stressors are coming at people, and there isn't clarity on what sort of accountabilities people have, what sort of commensurate authorities they have, then we get to some behavioral issues. We found this through years of experience in working with teams, that the team resorts to bad behavior as a result of lack of clarity of authority. It's not because people are bad. Sure, there might be 10% of the population that is, but there's 90% others who are not. They are just trying to get along. So when you design things for the 90%, or for, pardon me, for the 10%, you in fact alienate the 90%. Because 90% of those people are bringing their best game. But without this clarity, they resort to behaving poorly to get their work done. And if you grew up in Ontario years ago, I don't know whether it's still on the books these days, but if you remember the book, The Lord of the Flies, that's what happens when we don't have accountability and authority. So where does this come from? So what's it based on? Well, it has to come from my manager, as we already said. But you must be asking yourself, well, hang on a second. My boss doesn't know what I do. He or she's never around. They may not know how you do it, but they should know what you're accountable for. Because your work actually must emanate from the strategy.
So all the way up the hierarchy, regardless of where you are in the organization, it has to go all the way up to strategy.
All work comes from strategy. We exist to actually deliver the strategy of our organization inside the organization that we belong. And so the strategy defines the organization's function, the work of your manager's manager, the work of your manager, your role, and what you're accountable for and what authorities you have. Now, too often there's a disconnect between strategy and implementation. Strategy is often that thing that the organization spends lots of money on, that sits on a wall, but no one ever actually brings it into implementation. So now what we have to do is, when you're talking about accountability and authority, you are directly linking the work back to the strategy. And we find that our clients don't necessarily do that. If your work, your accountability, comes from the strategy, so then too must your authority.
Right.
And it has to emanate from the top. Now, some of you may be saying, well, wait a minute, hang on a second. Sure, we got a strategy, and we've got all of these bits around the strategy, but it's not directly linked. You need to ask yourself as a manager, how can I link the work of my employees to the strategy. If you are to get help in your work, in other words, authority, then it has to be based on the strategy. How we achieve our vision, how we fulfill our mission, how we achieve our objectives. To me, those are what the strategy is all about.
All right.
This is the manifestation of how we exist as an entity. So how do you get authority, you ask? Well, it's all well and good, but I don't do strategy work, and besides, the strategy is unclear, and I said that. How do I really get authority? Well, ultimately, you ask. You ask for clarity. So the first secret of today is authority is really only clarity. It's not about the will to power. It is about clarity around what power one has been bestowed with. So if you don't know, you need to ask. But, as with all things, you need to ask the right questions. So the next section that we're going to talk about is those authorities. What are the types of authority? And I talked about those earlier. We're going to learn more about these 7 authorities, and we're going to learn more about asking for clarity. So what are the types of authorities? Well, this is a deeper dive into those 7 types that I talked about earlier. And some of you out there may have had experience, particularly if you're a project manager, you may have had experience with a thing called RACI, the RACI model. This goes deeper than RACI. And I don't know, do you suppose there are people out there that have got experience with RACI?
And exactly, I'm going to launch another poll here, Julian, to find out which of you out there use the RACI model to clarify roles. While we're waiting for that to come back to us, Julian, why don't you fill us in? What is the RACI model?
Well, the RACI model, and there are variations on this acronym, but it's about identifying roles and responsibilities, I might add, during organizational change and projects and the like. So the R stands for responsible. Who's the owner? The A is who's accountable. Now, again, we're back to our problem of defining accountability and responsibility. But in other words, who signs off? Who actually approves the work? The C is for consulted. In other words, they have to be given information. And the I is who needs to be informed. Now, we've found that our clients don't get quite enough fidelity when they use the RACI model. It doesn't give them enough depth. It only goes so far.
And the indication I'm getting here, the whole, I think that's just about everybody coming back in, that no, there seems the majority of people do not use the RACI model, but there's a couple of people here doing it.
So this goes back to the accountability aspect. It is back to the basics, because RACI can be arbitrary, relying on mutual agreement, not necessarily the rational argument coming out of the strategy. And that is often how it is manipulated. The RACI model is manipulated in such a way that it is based on us coming to mutual agreement rather than based on accountability and ultimately then the authority piece. So these types of authority, just to quickly reiterate them again, these are all the categories needed to provide clarity around who has the authority to get what, from whom, in which instance. And by categorizing authority, we've streamlined the authority discussion. So the first 2 are important because they focus on the work of a manager. So to make decisions, well, as an individual within my own team, I need to be able to look at authority around decision making. It is similar to the second one we're going to talk about, which is resourcing, but making decisions is an important one because it ultimately describes full control. Managers have often told me that they aren't sure if they have a particular decision authority. Is it my decision or is it my boss's decision? Whose decision is it anyway? Kind of like, sounds like a game show, right?
And I can see how that would paralyze getting work done if everybody's trying to figure out who's driving it.
Well, and ultimately, if I'm trying to decide whether it's my boss's or mine, I spend inordinate amounts of time checking back, questioning, those sort of things. So is it my boss who decides? And how much time or money can I spend on this work is another aspect of the decision. These are decisions. And let's be clear on what is a decision, because it's often confused for people. Because a decision is making one choice and rejecting all others. And by the way, hanging over that decision is this great cloud of risks.
Right.
So quite often, we keep it nebulous because of the risk factor. So maybe my boss is going to want to pull that decision in, maybe they want to expand it out, all those various pieces. But do I have the right to sign off on this? If you're taking over a new role, you need to ask about this first. What decision-making authority do I have? Now, makes sense, I suppose. For all of you out there, you're probably going, I haven't really thought about it. But it doesn't always happen. And I think the reason why people don't ask about decision is because I might look stupid. I should have known that already is often the way people look at it.
Oh, I see. Sort of a fear of looking like you don't know what you're doing.
Exactly. Now, I've primarily talked about the relationship to my manager, but the lack of clarity around decision authority results in often endless questions and decisions, or questions and challenges to the decisions that I've already made.
Okay.
So, for example, when you clarify who gets the authority to make a decision, then nobody else can challenge that. When everyone can challenge the decisions that you make, quite often no decisions are made at all, or they are continually reversed. In other words, we don't get the work done. This is at the heart of inefficiency. Many managers tell me that this is the most destructive behavior, when others can challenge the decisions that are made. Because what you're doing is you're challenging other people, and you're ultimately impacting trust. With decision authority comes the ability to say, you focus on your work and I'll focus on my work. In other words, mind your own business.
And it stops drive-by judgment, drive-by interference.
Exactly. Without a clarity, it is a free-for-all. Anyone can challenge your thinking. Now, as I said, closely linked to the authority of decisions is the authority to expend resources. I get this authority from my manager directly. And to expend resources is really a variation on decision, but it does include money, time, and people. Not to suggest that people are just resources. But most importantly, I need to understand what sort of authority I have around those that work for me. Clarity about the authority of being a manager is critical for people to understand. Many new managers, even seasoned managers, don't understand this. They don't understand that they have the authority to make decisions on what work your employees are to do. Now, this is related to the clarity of having one boss. Only one person should be able to tell you what to do. Now, one thing that managers need to understand as well is ultimately your employees, in exchange for a paycheck, are expected to do their best work. They're expected to give you their best advice. This is the foundation of the contract in the workplace. This authority defines full control and sets the standard for defining partial control. In other words, I have full control, this is the work that you will do, and then what partial controls may come into play or not. Well, what about outside your team? What if from outside your team you need help from others? You need to look at the work that others are doing. Then you require clarity on what lateral authorities need to get your work done. As I said before, 70% of the work actually occurs laterally. So the 5 remaining authorities are those that secure resources from outside of your own team. So the first one is about telling people what to do. Now,
that sounds like a powerful one.
We call this prescribing. This is actually the authority that everybody wants. Everybody ultimately wants it, but it is exercised erroneously in a lot of cases. It's the ability to tell a peer or someone who is not a direct report what they should or even should not do. As you can see, the little people on boxes in this picture are telling their peers what to do. In some cases, even telling the red manager there what they should do. The red manager, however, is holding those other individuals who are not on boxes accountable for doing what those peers are telling. Now, that's what it looks like, but really we need to understand the dynamics of this. This has the biggest impact on trust. What a peer can tell another what to do or what not to do is like actually being the boss.
Being a manager, right, of course.
They are the ultimate resource now. So to be able to take a peer away from their work, that is defining how they will work. And this in turn damages trust. In our innate desire for control, we often step into behaving as though we are telling our peers how to work. Phrases like, and you may have heard this, Michael, the CEO wants this, in quotation marks, are used as a mechanism to get our way. We don't fully understand the implication of the impact and desire to gain control. When there is a lack of clarity around who actually has the hammer there, then people will automatically seize it.
Yes.
When bestowing this authority, though, I recommend you tread lightly. It should be given out sparingly. It should represent a situation where taking time to resolve a disagreement is untenable. I refer to this the life or limb scenario, when life or death is on the line. So some examples of this, in most organizations, health and safety functions have this sort of authority. An example of one of our clients, the pilot of the corporate jet, has this authority because he can tell the CEO, we're not flying today. Or the corporate doctor has the same. Now, a variation on telling people what to do is actually the authority to call a meeting. So in calling meetings, what you're doing is coordinating. Now, you're probably saying, well, hang on a second, I call meetings all the time. I'd ask you to pause for a moment and consider this. When you say that to someone, do I really expect them to show up to the meetings that I call? If I do, then you need to face the awful truth that you are telling them to stop doing what they need to be doing for their work and start doing something for your work. That needs to be defined further on. Now, thanks to software these days, this is actually a reality of our lives. Because, quite frankly, I can look into your calendar and invite you to a meeting with impunity.
Yeah.
Well, by wielding the authority to coordinate others, you are acting like a boss. And an example of the use of this type of authority is a project manager. Because ultimately, the project manager is pulling someone away from the work that they would normally be doing. But you need to define that.
So it's interesting, a project manager has the, well, literally the accountability to coordinate. And so, ergo, he or she needs the authority to do so.
Exactly. So combined with the clarity on decision authority, we find that there are fewer reasons to bring people together. In other words, if you define who has the decision authority, because quite often that's why we have meetings, because we're not sure whose decision it is anyway, and you define who has the authority to coordinate, there are fewer meetings. And this is a 1-2 punch for productivity, because now we can get back to efficiency and effectiveness and ultimately trust if we define those. So the next thing that we need to look at, and you might notice that as we're going along, we're getting to lesser and lesser degrees of impact on others. So the ability to tell people to stop or delay is what we term auditing and monitoring. As you'll notice in this picture, the little blue person there is putting up a stop. Now, they may be the third level down in the organization, but it is sanctioned by the red manager. This is the ability to look in at the work of others, and that's important sometimes. It's important for us to be able to look in and direct them to conform to your plan in some way. So an example is if you're accountable for IT infrastructure in your organization, you need the ability to tell people what platforms they can't use and to see what systems they are in fact using. I hear the great debate over iPhone versus BlackBerry out there,
right,
as an example. If you're accountable for developing talent, you should have the ability to tell peers that a non-conforming supplier cannot be used. Because what you're doing is you're driving a strategy for talent. What you're doing is you're driving a strategy for IT infrastructure.
So it gives you the authority to track down and stop renegade parts of the organization that choose to go somewhere else besides the strategy.
Exactly. So we call this a fairness authority. And it comes with a concept called escalation. And I call it a fairness authority because if I'm accountable to deliver a strategy, I need to be able to influence how that strategy is being implemented by others. And escalation is important in this. And it comes in two forms. In the strongest form here, where I have the authority to tell someone to stop, we call that auditing. The authority to tell someone they must stop doing something, and if they disagree with me, she needs to tell her boss why she is not following the strategy. Don't worry, at the same time, Michael, you're going to escalate as well.
Okay, I see. So it goes straight up to the next level.
Whereas in the authority to delay, well, that's the monitoring. This is a lesser power and has less of an impact on trust. Because what you're doing is you're asking them to delay while you escalate for clarity from your boss to see how this fits. Here is why it's important. Because what you're doing is you're clarifying the authority to stop and the authority to delay from a manager rather than you seizing that power based on your belief, your sense of responsibility over the strategy.
So those managers to whom we have escalated, I take it in theory what happens is that they then go up to some sort of a crossover manager level to get the final word, if it needs to go that high.
Exactly. So this can be a layered authority as well. The boss gets the stronger but delegates the lesser because it will create less damage to the relationships with peers. The core of this auditing and monitoring authority is that they are sanctioned. And often, as you say, the crossover manager from well above my manager. It is the authority to look at what others are doing, and this is the authority to question the decisions that others make. So again, back to our point around understanding the nature of questioning decisions, it's important. It's important to have that clarity, but it must be based on the strategy. Now I'm going to talk about one that is at the forefront of everybody's mind out there, and that is the authority to get service. This is the most common and misunderstood authority. This is the authority to get another resource, usually a peer or an associate, to do work for you. When handled badly, service getting can look like the service requester appearing condescending. You have to give me that resource right now. You have to give me that service right now. On the other hand, on the receiver, the service provider, in turn, responds in a surly fashion and creates havoc that way. Both the requester and the provider need to be managed. And they're managed by their own managers. Remember, only one boss. How effective was the request? How well was it delivered? Both parties are held accountable. So what are the parameters for service provision? The authority to get service means that the service must be provided, and we forget that. The variables, however, are when the service is provided and to what quality the work is to be done. These are critical misunderstandings often in service getting. Often we believe we should get the service right now, and it's to the standard that I absolutely define as a service getter. The point is that I will get the service, but when is actually has to be negotiated. So what happens to the service you need to fulfill your strategy can't be delivered when you need it? Well, you need to escalate it. Not to their manager, but to your manager. If your sanctioned authority can't be delivered when you need it, you need to tell your boss. It's not that you're ratting them out, but to advise them that your boss that you can't deliver what you were expected on time. And again, this is not one-sided. The provider also escalates because they are not able to provide and fulfill the expectation that their manager had for them.
Yeah.
The last of these authorities is to provide advice. It's fairly straightforward. It's also known as advisory authority.
Funny that.
This is the authority to advise someone based on your expertise. So as you can see, that mid-level manager is providing advice not only to the level above them, but also to their peers and also to the level below. Clarity on this authority contributes to getting work done in two ways. It ensures that those that need advice to get their work done will get it.
Right.
In other words, it ensures that the corporate strategy is achieved by capitalizing on the resources in the organization. This is based on a set of expertise. And the other way that this ensures that getting the work done is that only those with that specific expertise will do the advising. It reduces the second guessing of decisions, as you talked about earlier. In other words, it reduces the drive-by advice that goes on inside organizations. The authority is bestowed based on the strategy and sanctioned by the managers. If the advice is ignored, it is not the role of the advisor to pester the individual. That's up to their manager, because that piece of advice is part of the strategy. If you choose to ignore it, you will be held accountable by your manager. In other words, it's again not about the will to power, but it is about providing that advice so that the work can get done. So those are the 7 types of authority. So in other words, what we've looked at is all about authority and getting work done. What is authority? How do I get the authority? And what are the types of authority?
Thank you very much, Julian. I think we have a few minutes here for some questions. And while I'm waiting for that to come in, let me just throw out the big one to you here. Authority has always seemed like a nebulous idea to me, but what you're saying is that these 7 authorities represent basically the totality of authority in an office environment.
Exactly. And part of it is taking the time to work this out so that people can engage, so that they can work efficiently, effectively, and in a trusting manner, which forms the foundation of successful workplaces.
So the clarity and a rational list to go through in the process of figuring out the authorities. Great. I've got a great question here from Yvonne in Toronto. Can I have authority, like service getting, over someone who has a higher level than me?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Levels are not the critical function here. It is about how does the work move inside the organization. So the strategy will define where that work comes from. So of course, so it's not about being frightened to have that conversation with that SVP, Yvonne. It's about that the strategy is defined that you should get that service in order to deliver your work.
So it goes back to the idea of this is about clarity, not power.
Exactly.
Okay. That's really cool. And one more question I've got here. This is just cycling back. Julian, you mentioned that there's a distinction between the first two sets of authorities and the later five. Do you want to just reiterate on that?
So the authority to make decisions and to expend resources are what managers define as in the up and down relationship. I get that authority over my manager, or clarity of that authority over my manager. Whereas the remaining five are all about what do I get laterally in the way of relationship to my peers, or those above me in other departments, or those below me in other departments.
So that's interesting, managerial authority then at every single level of the organization. So those two things, from the CEO to the EVP or the manager to the front line, is it's the same idea, same concept. Okay, whereas the balance of five is laterally across the organization. I think that we have actually run out of time, so I would like to thank everybody very much for listening in. And we have been listening to Julian Chapman talk about who has the hammer, authority in getting work done. This has been a Forrest & Company webinar, part of our growing list of resources available through our Forest Fire channel. To sign up for the Forest Fire Communications Group, please visit our website, www.forestandco.com, and click on the Communications Group button. Registration is free, and you can unsubscribe at any time, but it's my job that you don't, to make sure that you don't want to. Thank you all very much, and have a great afternoon.